I almost missed this function today, but I carried this burden for so long that I felt that today I can lay it down. And I asked the Minister of Housing to make sure that I'm invited to today's function. So I'm here at short notice, because I really wanted to see this project completed. And today for me is the beginning of the completion of a long journey. This project represents everything that is Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of potential, a lot of good, and too much that is bad. And permit me today, if I identify them all, with the hope that as we go forward, we would relive what is good, realize the potential, and pass on what is bad. You would have heard that this project was started in 2006. We are now handing out the first set of completed units in 2018. And let me repeat that. A project that was started in 2006. We are beginning to complete it because this is the first block of 4 or so. Block number 1 is now complete. The others are still under construction. We are hoping for completion during this year. But 12 years to complete a housing development project. And this is not the only one. Permit me to get personal on this. I heard my colleague talk about our political opponents. It is not only your political opponents that can do bad things, your political friends can do bad things too. This project wasn't stopped by our political opponent. It fell prey to our own politics in the PNM. You may recall one day in the Parliament, our Prime Minister got up and mentioned that $10 million was missing from the HDC, and the minister had to account for it. The minister being me, because the other minister had told the then Prime Minister that $10 million was missing. That resulted in the Commission of Inquiry. You all forgot that? I could never forget that. Commission of Inquiry. And in search of that 10 million, all these projects became casualties of that development. And then soon after, we lost the election. And worse was to come. Because the new government, a government that spent record billions, starting the national budget at 50 billion or thereabouts, 52 billion, and climbed it to 63 billion by the time they left office. 5 years of record budgets. And I would pass this street every day going east. And pass down the highway on the foreshore going home in the afternoon. And I would look at this project. And I would think of the 137 families that could have been living here if the governance of Trinidad and Tobago was different. 137 families were denied access to urban improvement and houses because politicians in Trinidad and Tobago from both sides did what I just told you. And you know the painful part about that? The one from my party lives on a stone somewhere and every so often appears out of the stone to criticize as former minister. And the ones who left it here for 5 years and did not pull a stroke for 5 years are still in the parliament asking the current government, what you borrowing money for? We must account to them why we borrow money. Now that we've lost a significant portion of our revenues and we are finishing these units with what little we have, those who spent record billions and did not complete a single unit in here, in the parliament still, telling you that they are looking out for the public interests and they want accountability and they want to know what the government is doing here and what the government is doing there, and they must tell them this and they must tell them that. I tell you this today so that you, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, must know that it is possible to elect bad people into government in Trinidad and Tobago, and they come on both sides. This project is a project to house 137 families. The land belonged to the Port of Spain Corporation. It was occupied by a squatter. The minister will tell you that the vast majority of applications for housing in this country runs from Carenage to Sangre Grande, the east-west corridor. That's where the bulk of the applicants come from, largely because the bulk of the persons who are without housing live in that area. But that is the area with the least amount of land available to build houses on. So when the program existed in 2004, 2005, we were looking around in the east-west corridor for land that could be put to better use to satisfy the needs of those families that were desperately looking for housing. And this piece of land was identified. And this is another part of the bad behavior in Trinidad and Tobago. This area was largely occupied by a squatter who suddenly discovered that the HDC was interested in the land, Port of Spain Corporation land. And I don't know if you recall how many weeks, how many Sundays as Minister of Housing, I was pilloried on radio and everywhere else by persons who were defending that squatter and defending his right to access and ownership of this large parcel of land. Because we in Trinidad and Tobago somehow have difficulty in differentiating right from wrong. The law in this country allows relief for a squatter on a housing plot of land if, under the law, they were occupying this piece of land and they've been there for a particular period of time. Laws of recent vintage have given rights to that person for that plot of land. But this piece of land is a lot more than a housing plot. It's a very large piece of land. But there was a big argument and a lot of attacks and unpleasantries aimed at the government, aimed at the ministry, aimed at the Housing Development Corporation, aimed at the minister, because we wanted to take this land for the public interest. We had to go to court. Eventually, good sense prevailed and the land became available to the HDC with the corporation of the Port of Spain Corporation, and we had this land available to house 137 families. The cost of that, the construction, was $113 million. Even so, those of you who are going to access these units, even though you may not, and some of you definitely will not, acknowledge that you're getting a huge gift from the nation, because the price that you will pay is a subsidized price. well below the actual value. But we talk about affordable housing. We try to make it so that you could afford it. So the government accepts the cost of the value of the land, the infrastructure, and much of the construction, and the units are made available to you. I think its cabinet has approved them at $650,000. Go look in the newspapers, any one of them, and see if you could see any apartment, any townhouse available for $650,000. The cheapest one is $1 million. But how can we talk about affordable housing for families in desperate need and the price is $1 million? Means that you would never afford it. So the government subsidizes the unit to you. And I want to ask you to appreciate that. And if your country has done nothing for you, those of you who live in public housing, acknowledge that you are accessing assisted housing. And insofar as you're raising your children in that environment as against where you were before, your landlord might not be as bad as the one just described, but many landlords can be so described. But to come back to the 113 million, for 5 years, this unit stayed here, incomplete. The same department that could not find the money to complete them so that these families could move in, found $120 million extra to pay for a piece of land in Couva that wasn't supposed to be bought. Same ministry, the Ministry of Housing and Development. Same minister, Minister Mudilal, Minister of Housing. The cabinet instruction then when I was Minister of Housing was that the government should not buy any land in central Trinidad, simply because the government owned most of its land in central Trinidad, the Caroni lands. So therefore, if we are going to do housing in central, we should use the land that the government already has. So while we were looking around the rest of the country and would get cabinet approval to buy land in other areas, because the state owns so much available land in the Caroni arrangements in Central and some of it in South Trinidad, that cabinet decision was taken. I'm not aware that the cabinet decision was ever changed. And it takes a cabinet decision to change a cabinet decision. So my understanding is that when the land was bought in Eden Gardens, it was bought against a cabinet decision that said that it shouldn't be bought. But the cabinet went ahead and bought it. So the cabinet was changing the cabinet decision. The valuation on that parcel of land done by a commercial valuer was that the land was worth $52 million. Those in the parliament today who want accountability, and they want to know this, and they want to know that, and they're defending you, and they're the best, and they come back in the next election, they paid $175 million for that piece of land, with a valuation that said it's worth $52 million. And I'm saying to you today, they could have found $120 million more to give the owner of that land, but they couldn't find $113 million to finish these apartments here. And I passed here for 5 years, watching them, vines growing on them. But you, the people, intervened in 2015, and you put a different government into office with far less resources, but with a different appreciation of what the government should do. And that is how we have come back here with far less resources, and we are finishing these units block by block. And God willing, before the end of the year, we should finish every block in here, and 137 families would live in this very salubrious zone. This is not the kind of story I like to tell about my country, but it's the kind of story that you mustn't forget, because it was a West Indian author and thinker, Frantz Fanon, who says that to forget the past is to surrender the future, because you'll do it again. You'll do it again. Because, you know, whenever you speak about these things, those who have to account for that tell you they don't want to hear. Because you're only blaming them. Now, who do you want me to blame? Who do you want me to hold accountable? And why don't you want to remember what happened to you? So it can happen again? Well, I will remind you every time, because this represents the worst of Trinidad and Tobago. I was doing an exercise just trying to figure out how much public lands have fallen into private hands in this country, with or without authority. And the figure is in the billions. Billions of dollars of public asset. And this particular site, had we not stood up in defense of the 137 families, this piece of land would have fallen into private hands for private benefit, and 137 families would have been deprived access to this location. Fortunately, that did not happen. We are currently facing not just this project, but many others like it, which were left unattended when we had money. As I speak to you now, there are a number of schools at various stages of completion. The government is struggling to find money to either pay the contractors who have done the work or to pay completion to contractors who will complete the work. Number of schools across the country. And I will not be surprised if the very said people who put us in that situation don't come out front and point out to you that this school isn't finished, and vine growing on that school, and that school isn't finished. The reason why we are completing these units, I understand that for $44 million for this block, completing it. And we're into an arrangement when this one is complete and your monies keep coming in, we use that money to go on to the next block and so on. So we roll it on towards completion. That is how we are able to complete what has been left incomplete, because we just don't have the available resources in the same way that we had when we initiated this project. But we did have the resources to complete it, because the same pocket that the money came from to pay $120 million more for the land in Eden Gardens is the same pocket that was required to pay for this project. But it was a question of priority, because the government has to make priorities every single day, whether it is spent on health, medicine for the hospital, paying the teachers, building a new road, building a housing block, or paying a contractor. Same pocket. The option was there to spend that $120 million finishing this project or similar ones. This government has chosen to finish these projects so that they could benefit those for whom the projects were conceived initially and for whom it is intended on completion. In this area, this is the second such project that we are completing. A few months ago, we completed the Victoria Keys apartments. 3 towers, again, land being scarce. We had to try and find space. In that project, we cut the hillside in the face of objections, of course. We used the fill to reclaim land at Movietown. Today there's a $1 billion piece of real estate down there, and we got 200 and odd units at Victoria Keys for occupancy in a very desirable area. And as we sought to do that, when it wasn't the squatter saying, it's my own and therefore I should have it, it was the environmentalist saying that don't touch the environment because we are destroying the environment. But I want to ask you, go down to Victoria Keys and see if what has happened there is the destruction of the environment or the good use to which the location has been put. When we fought for this site, there was an environmental argument here too. Not only that the squatter had a right to it because he had illegally occupied it for a number of years, but there was an argument that a family of agoutis live here. And if we interfere with this site, the agoutis will be disturbed. I would be the first to want to encourage agouti families to live undisturbed, as I do where I live in Tobago. I have agoutis in my yard. They come, they go, and I enjoy it. But if you have to put the thing to serious use, it couldn't be a serious argument, as I had to face 12 years ago, that we mustn't build houses here because a family of agoutis live here. That's what we face. But that we have to overcome all of these things. We can have the housing, and we can have the agoutis. We can have the housing at Victoria Keys, we can have the reclaimed land at Movitown, and we can have people housed in an area where housing is desperately needed. Ladies and gentlemen, the housing policy has evolved to one now which is driven largely by the fact that the government does not have in its account the large sums of monies required to build the large number of units for which there is demand. So we've come up with a number of different approaches to bring all kinds of resources to bear on the objective. The objective being that we have more houses built in the country. So as we go forward, the government will continue to build apartment-type units and similar units, focusing largely on the rental side of things. Because a lot of those people who look to the public sector housing for their shelter can only afford to contribute by way of rental. So if there are not sufficient stocks of rental units available in various communities, with the best will in the world, you would still end up with a significant piece of the population not being properly housed because no rental units are available for them. So the government will assume the role to contribute more and more of these rental units, affordable units. But where persons who look to the HDC can contribute by way of paying a mortgage, an affordable mortgage, the government will continue to try to have units available so that they can enter into a mortgage with the HDC to get a unit. But to get the unit available, because the government is constrained by its own resources, the government has come up with this program which the minister just mentioned a while ago, which is now ready for kicking off, where we invite the private sector to mobilize their resources with a guarantee from the government that completed units will be taken to satisfy the HDC demand on terms and conditions which will see the builder getting up to $100,000 as a stimulus and a bonus on a unit. That is ending as a better deal for the state. Because when the government builds these units, it costs the government more than $1 million to build one. But if we can get them built by the private sector for well under $1 million, and we incentivize them by only $100,000 for each unit that the government did not build, but which was built by the private sector on agreed terms and costs, we save significant sums and we incentivize the private sector with that. So we get the units built, we mobilize the private sector monies, and we house the persons who look to the HDC for. That's the second approach. A third approach is where land is available and infrastructure exists, as in some parts of central Trinidad. We make the housing lots available. And you would have heard the minister talking about that, where we have an aided self-help program. We make the lots available and we provide other assistance to persons to build their own homes. And as the government financial situation improves in the future, as we expect it to improve, we are going to go back and use more of the original model that was very successful in Tobago, of having available a pool of funds for on lending to those ambitious persons who could come and borrow at very considerate conditions, where you can borrow cheaply and build your home to your own taste and to your own ambition. That model has worked extremely well in Tobago, and it was the model that was used to rebuild Tobago after Hurricane Flora had decimated the housing stock in Tobago. Most of the houses you'll see in Tobago were built by individuals who accessed soft loans at the NHA and built their own homes. That's another model that we would use in Trinidad as we go forward once the government is able to find the pool of funds to put there as a soft loan. And of course, all of this requires that we have as much rollover as possible. Those of you who have got a unit, a house is not a hop's bread. It probably is the most expensive thing that you'll ever engage in your life, depending on how your life goes. But most economists will tell you that shelter should cost you about 1/3 of your income. And of course, after you buy a house, you have liabilities, you have responsibilities. You have to pay your mortgage, because the government, more than likely, would have borrowed to pay the contractor. And that loan has to be repaid, and it's being repaid by your payments. That's how the money goes. Money in the bank, lend to the HDC, pay the contractor bills, you get the unit, you pay for your unit, you own it, that money goes back to the bank, we can borrow again, we can build again. That system will work well if you do your part. And of course, I am very pleased to have seen the skit this evening where the players pointed out that where you live would largely be a function of what you do. So let me do what I normally would have done if I was Minister of Housing. Now that you're moving in here, this is as good a housing stock as anywhere in the country. As good a housing stock as anywhere outside the country, where you go and come back and say how nice the place is, and how clean the streets are, and how wonderful it is to go there for a vacation. And I'm saying that you can make this, and you must make this the description of your own place. So let's start with that. No sneakers on strings on the wires. No hanging out of clothes outside. And no behavior unbecoming of a decent citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. That is what makes the difference between a quality neighborhood and one that you're quick to call a ghetto. Because I don't know where that term came from. It certainly wasn't an original term in Trinidad and Tobago. But it has to do with how you treat your own neighborhood, how you treat your own backyard, how you treat your own veranda, and how you treat and live with your neighbor. The government can do only so much, and we will do all that is expected of the government, and then it's up to you. There's one particular neighborhood in Valencia that I happened to have gone through a while back. And you walk this street, and you get the impression that every household on this street, every house is occupied by people who take a pride in their neighborhood. From the way they keep the yard, from the way the house is presented, from the way the street is kept clean. And you see that somebody puts an effort. Each house is kept like that. And when you look at the street, you say this is a nice place to live. And that signals that people who live there are taking the responsibility and making the effort to present and preserve their neighborhood in a way that is attractive not only to them, but to those who may come and visit. We in Trinidad and Tobago are not going through our best of times now. But it won't always be like that. We need to work ourselves out of that situation. And today, I'm very pleased to be here with the Minister of Housing and his team to make available the first 44 units out of 137. And I look forward to coming again before the end of the year as the others are completed, and to meet you here in your new neighborhood accepting that you have been fortunate from the list of over 100,000 to have been selected for these units. It is the best that the country could afford, and you are the most fortunate. So I want to thank the minister for driving his team. I want to thank all those who restarted this project. I want to thank the mayor of Port of Spain for the cooperation of the Port of Spain Corporation in having this parcel of land being made available for public housing. And I want to end on the note that this is not the only area that we have high hopes of raising the quality of housing and making houses available. We are currently engaged in East Port of Spain as part of our urban renewal effort in talking to people in Piccadilly, where the quality of housing is such that it requires removal and replacement. But the biggest problem we face there is getting people to understand that we can only do that if those who are there cooperate with the state. I trust that there's cooperation so that we could do the slum clearance, create the parcel of land like this, and then to build the new structures that will house not only those who are there in the decrepit buildings now, but create additional units for others who would enjoy the location, which today is not being maximized and is not being used to its fullest potential. It was a source of great disappointment to me many years ago when I was housing minister, when we sought to embark upon that kind of exercise in Duncan and Nelson Street, and persons were encouraged not to cooperate with the government to bring about the kind of development that we envisioned. I trust that that wouldn't happen again, Madam Minister. I trust that the people would have seen what could have been done, what could be done, and what must be done. And whether it is Sea Lots, Nelson Street, Duncan Street, Clifton Hill, Piccadilly, the government and the community working together, even with limited resources, we can do wonders. What was a location occupied by a single squatter is today Port of Spain's newest community. Welcome to Viewfort. Welcome to the city of Port of Spain. Thank you very much.